The Galactic Council chamber was a marvel of cosmic engineering, a perfect sphere suspended in null gravity, its walls constructed from metamaterials that could shift between transparency, opacity, and holographic projection faster than a human could blink. 17 different atmospheric zones maintained precise environmental conditions for the 17 distinct species present, each microcosm a delicate bubble of survival pressed against its neighbors. At the center of this intricate balance stood Ambassador Sarah Chen. She knew exactly how she looked to the other delegates. A small, unremarkable human woman in a tailored black suit, her only adornment a simple data crystal suspended from a platinum chain. No elaborate bio-augmentations, no neural interface crowns, no chromatic skin modifiers that most diplomatic corps considered standard issue. Just her, exactly as she intended. The tension in the chamber was more volatile than any physical weapon. The Krellink's delegation, massive silicon-based entities that looked like living crystal mountain ranges, vibrated with a low, threatening frequency. Opposite them, the luminary representatives flickered and pulsed, their energy forms contained within intricate crystalline matrices that looked like living prisms of pure information. 17 conflicts. 16 previous attempts at mediation, countless lives lost, and now humanity's first real test on the galactic diplomatic stage. Captain Lorax of the Krellink's delegation turned his massive crystalline form, sending refracted light dancing across the chamber. His communication translator, a bulky device that looked like a cross between a quantum computer and an abstract sculpture, crackled to life. 17 cycles. He began, his voice a series of precise mathematical frequencies that human ears could barely perceive. 17 cycles of diplomatic failure. And now the youngest species thinks they can resolve what no other could. A ripple of controlled laughter, more a mathematical expression of derision than actual sound, passed through the alien delegates. Sarah counted precisely 7.3 seconds before responding, her voice calm and measured. Not resolve, she corrected, understand. The subtle distinction hung in the air like a challenge. Behind her, the human delegation was a study in controlled tension. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, her chief strategist and the architect of their unprecedented approach, adjusted his neural interface, his fingers moving in subtle, almost imperceptible calculations. To her left, Diplomatic Security Chief Elena Gonzalez stood like a coiled spring, her cybernetic augmentations humming with potential energy. They were humanity's first true diplomatic mission of this magnitude. Everything rode on this moment. The luminary arch-mediator, a being of pure energy that most species interpreted as a living computational matrix, pulsed with what could only be described as anticipatory contempt. Its form was both everywhere and nowhere, a living hologram that defied traditional biological understanding. 17 attempts. The arch-mediator's voice was a symphony of mathematical precision. 17 failures. What makes humanity believe they can succeed where collective galactic intelligence has repeatedly failed? Sarah's fingers brushed the data crystal around her neck. Inside that tiny object was the culmination of 5 years of work, an AI-driven analysis so comprehensive, so ruthlessly objective, that it had already been declared either a breakthrough or an act of unprecedented diplomatic suicide. She knew the statistics, knew them better than anyone in the room. The conflict between the Krellinks and Luminary wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a generations-long wound that had consumed entire star systems, redirected entire civilizational development paths, and created a cascade of economic and cultural consequences that most species couldn't even begin to comprehend. 17 attempts, 16 failures. This would be the 17th, and humanity intended to break the pattern. The chamber fell silent. 17 species, countless years of conflict. One human diplomat, one impossible mission. Sarah Chen took a single measured step forward. Game time. 5 years earlier, the research facility looked like something between a war room and a technological fever dream. Holographic displays flickered with impossible complexity, tracking data points that spanned millennia of galactic conflict. Empty caffeine containers and half-eaten nutrition cubes littered workstations where brilliant minds had been pushed beyond conventional limits. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez slammed his hand against a quantum processing unit, sending a cascade of error messages dancing across the primary display. "It's impossible," he muttered, not for the first time. Sarah Chen didn't even look up. Her eyes, augmented with custom neural interfaces, were fixed on a three-dimensional data matrix that looked like a living, breathing ecosystem of information. "Impossible is just an invitation we haven't answered yet," she replied. Their team was a collection of academic outcasts, each brilliant but deemed too unconventional by their respective institutions. Dr. Aisha Okoro, a conflict resolution expert who had been blacklisted from 3 major research universities for her radical approaches to interspecies communication. Jonathan Kim, a quantum systems analyst who had been fired from the Pan-Pacific Research Consortium for suggesting that most existing diplomatic models were fundamentally flawed. They called themselves the outliers, and they were humanity's last, best hope for a breakthrough. The project had begun as a simple computational challenge. Could they create an AI system capable of analyzing interstellar conflicts with complete objectivity? But it had quickly become something far more revolutionary. The problem with traditional diplomatic approaches, Sarah had explained during their initial team meeting, is that they're built on narrative, not data. Every species comes to the table with a story. We're going to replace stories with facts. Their AI, which they had sarcastically named Truth, Transactional Relational Universal Transparency Hypothesis, was unlike any computational system ever created. It didn't just process information. It deconstructed it, analyzed its fundamental components, and reassembled understanding in ways that defied conventional analytical models. Dr. Okoro's expertise in cultural linguistics provided the system with nuanced translation capabilities that went beyond mere language. She had developed a methodology that could decode not just words, but the entire contextual framework of communication. "Language is a virus," she would often say, "and we're going to sequence its DNA." Jonathan Kim's quantum processing models allowed Trivith to handle computational complexity that would have crashed traditional systems. He had developed adaptive algorithms that could process multiple conflicting information streams simultaneously, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. And at the center of it all was Sarah Chen. Her background was itself a study in unconventional paths. Born to a quantum physicist mother and a diplomatic historian father, she had been raised to see the universe as a complex system of interconnected relationships. Her doctoral thesis, which had been roundly rejected by every major academic institution, proposed that most interspecies conflicts were fundamentally misunderstandings caused by computational and communication errors, rather than genuine ideological differences. "We're not solving conflicts," she would argue. "We're solving mistranslations." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday, 3 years into their research. Rodriguez had been running a routine diagnostic when the system suddenly produced a correlation that should have been impossible. "Look at this," he called out, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The holographic display showed a series of resource allocation records from the Krullinx luminary conflict. What had appeared to be decades of intentional territorial aggression was actually the result of a computational rounding error in an ancient survey. A single decimal point, misplaced thousands of years ago, had potentially caused generations of conflict. "We've found it," Sarah whispered, her hand hovering over the display. The lie that became truth. Their funding had been perpetually on the edge of collapse. Government research grants, private investors, even crowdfunding campaigns had kept them barely afloat. Most considered their work a joke, an impossible dream of academic misfits. But they knew something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The truth doesn't care about your beliefs. It simply exists. And they were going to make the galaxy listen. The moment Sarah activated her presentation system, the chamber's ambient temperature dropped precisely 2.7 degrees. It wasn't a technical malfunction. It was calculated. her data crystal, a device that looked embarrassingly primitive compared to the advanced holographic interfaces surrounding her, connected to the Council's central system. For a millisecond, nothing happened. Then everything happened. Holographic displays erupted across the chamber like a computational supernova. Raw data streams began flowing faster than most species could comprehend. Visual representations, mathematical correlations, historical records that spanned multiple civilizational life cycles. The arch-mediator of the luminary, a being of pure energy contained within a fractal crystal structure, actually stopped moving. Its internal computational matrix, which could typically process billions of calculations per nanosecond, seemed to stutter. Impossible. It transmitted, the word more a mathematical equation than a statement. Sarah didn't respond verbally. Instead, she let the data speak. The first wave of information targeted the fundamental assumptions of the Krullink's luminary conflict. Geological surveys from 3,742 years ago began to unfold, their pixels reconstructing entire planetary landscapes. Hidden within these ancient records was a computational error so subtle, so perfectly camouflaged, that it had driven generations of conflict. A single misplaced decimal point. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, watching from the human delegation's secure zone, allowed himself the smallest smile. They had spent 3 years teaching their AI to not just find data, but to understand the contextual lie within the truth. The chamber's atmospheric regulators began to fluctuate, not from any technical failure, but from the sheer computational stress of processing the information Sarah was presenting. In your historical records, Sarah began, her voice calm and precise. You've maintained that the territorial conflict between the Krullinks and Luminary began with a resource dispute in the Epsilon Quadrant. Our analysis suggests something different. A holographic representation of the Epsilon Quadrant materialized. But this wasn't a standard galactic map. This was a living, breathing computational model that showed every single data point, every communication, every resource transaction for the past 4 millennia. The Krullink's representative, Captain Lorax, began to vibrate at a frequency that suggested pure computational panic. These are our sealed records, he transmitted, his crystalline structure flickering. How could a human accessed? Sarah interrupted. No. Reconstructed. There's a difference. The difference was terrific. Their AI hadn't just retrieved data. It had rebuilt entire contextual frameworks, finding connections that no traditional analytical system could perceive. Embedded within the data were communication records that no one had ever connected. Trade agreements that suggested cooperation, not conflict. Genetic markers that indicated a shared evolutionary history. Mathematical models that proved the conflict was, fundamentally, a massive misunderstanding. Dr. Aisha Okoro had spent 2 years developing linguistic algorithms that could decode not just words, but the entire communicative context. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing models allowed them to see patterns invisible to traditional analysis. The human delegation washed with calculated composure. This wasn't just a presentation. This was computational warfare. Every species in the chamber knew something unprecedented was happening. Humans weren't just challenging the conflict's narrative. They were systematically dismantling it at its most fundamental level. The data continued to flow. Geological shifts that had been misinterpreted as territorial aggression. Communication breakdowns that had been viewed as intentional hostility. Resource allocation models that revealed not competition, but potential collaboration. Sarah's final visualization was a masterpiece of computational art. It showed the entire conflict not as a linear progression of hostilities, but as a complex, interconnected system of misunderstandings. Conflict, she said quietly, is often just a failure of communication. The chamber went silent, not the silence of respect, the silence of absolute computational shock. They had come expecting a diplomatic presentation. They were witnessing the deconstruction of 4 millennia of established galactic understanding. and humanity was just getting started. The genetic analysis hit like a quantum shockwave. Dr. Aisha Okoro's linguistic and genetic correlation algorithms began to project a holographic representation that literally took the breath away from every species in the chamber. What appeared at first to be a complex molecular dance was actually a genealogical map that rewrote 4 millennia of understood history. The Krellinks and Luminary weren't just distant relatives. They were almost identical genetic cousins. Impossible, Captain Lorax of the Krellinks transmitted, his crystalline form fracturing with computational distress. Our entire historical record is a lie. Sarah Chen completed his thought. The holographic display began to peel back layers of genetic history like a living document. Each molecular strand told a story more complex than centuries of conflict had ever suggested. The original separation between the Krellinks and Luminary wasn't a territorial dispute, it was a technological diaspora. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing modules had discovered something extraordinary. The computational error that had sparked their initial research was merely the tip of an astronomical iceberg. Approximately 4,127 years ago, a single technological event had split what was once a unified civilization into 2 distinct evolutionary paths. The Krellinks had developed silicon-based computational matrices. The Luminary had become pure energy-based information systems, but their origin, identical. "You were never enemies," Sarah stated, her voice cutting through the chamber's stunned silence. "You were survivors of the same catastrophic event." The holographic display began to reconstruct the moment of separation. A massive stellar event, now proven to be a controlled technological experiment gone wrong, had forced a rapid evolutionary divergence. The Krellinks had developed physical resilience, adapting to survive in harsh planetary conditions. The Luminary had transformed into pure energy, becoming computational entities that could survive in the most extreme environments. But the cost of survival had been a complete fracturing of their shared history. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez stepped forward, activating a secondary data stream that began to show communication records that had been buried for millennia. Trade agreements, collaborative research, shared cultural markers that had been systematically erased from both civilizations' historical records. "Your conflict," he explained, his voice clinical and precise, "is a computational error that became a cultural reality. The arch-mediator of the Luminary, a being of pure energy that typically maintained absolute computational composure, began to pulse with what could only be described as emotional turbulence. Its fractal crystal matrix started to destabilize, sending ripples of pure information through the chamber." Sarah's presentation wasn't just revealing a historical misunderstanding. It was systematically dismantling the fundamental narrative that had defined 2 entire civilizations for thousands of years. The genetic analysis showed something even more profound. The separation hadn't been a clean break. For centuries, members of both species had been carrying genetic markers that suggested potential reunification, dormant genetic sequences that could potentially bridge the evolutionary divide. "We're not just showing you your history," Sarah said quietly. "We're showing you your potential future." The chamber's ambient temperature continued to drop, not from any technical malfunction, but from the pure computational shock of the revelation. Captain Lorax's communication translator began to malfunction, producing sounds that were half mathematical equation, half emotional breakdown. The Luminary Arch-Mediator's energy patterns flickered between pure information and something that, in any other context, would be described as grief. 17 previous diplomatic missions had failed because they had approached the conflict as a territorial dispute. The humans were treating it as a massive, multi-generational misunderstanding, and they were proving it with mathematical precision. The data continued to flow. Communication records, genetic markers, computational analyses that showed not just the history of the conflict, but the absolutely unnecessary nature of the generations-long hostility. Sarah Chen stood at the center of the chamber, the data crystal around her neck pulsing with a soft, almost living light. They had come to deliver facts. What they were doing was rewriting reality. The moment of collapse wasn't dramatic. It was precise, calculated. Captain Lorax of the Krellings, a being composed of living crystalline structures that had weathered centuries of conflict, began to fracture. Not physically, but informationally. His entire computational matrix, a network of quantum connections that represented generations of cultural memory, started to disintegrate under the weight of undeniable truth. The luminary arch-mediator was worse. Pure energy beings aren't supposed to show emotion. They're computational matrices, living information systems that process reality with mathematical precision. But as Sarah Chen's presentation continued, the arch-mediator's energy patterns began to oscillate in ways that defied every known law of quantum communication. It was grieving. Dr. Aisha Okoro watched the display with clinical precision, her neural interfaces capturing every microscopic change in the alien being's computational structures. What was happening wasn't just a diplomatic breakdown. It was a complete civilizational identity crisis. Generations, the arch-mediator finally transmitted, its energy patterns fragmenting. Generations of conflict. Built on a computational error, the holographic displays continued to pulse with evidence, not just genetic markers or historical records, but the human team's most devastating weapon: context. They had reconstructed entire communication networks that had been deliberately destroyed. Trade agreements erased. Collaborative research projects buried. Cultural exchanges systematically eliminated. The conflict between the Krellings and Luminary wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a deliberate, sustained act of mutual cultural destruction. And now, they were watching their entire reality collapse. Sarah Chen understood something profound about conflict that most diplomatic corps missed. Information is warfare. And they were conducting a precision strike directly at the heart of two civilizations' understanding of themselves. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing modules had done something unprecedented. They hadn't just analyzed the data. They had reconstructed entire communication networks that had been deliberately fragmented over millennia. Messages, trade records, scientific collaborations, all meticulously restored, showing the history of potential cooperation that had been systematically erased. Captain Lorax's crystalline structure began to produce sounds that were half mathematical equation, half existential breakdown. The translation systems in the chamber struggled to comprehend the emotional complexity. "We killed them." He transmitted the words, a complex computational wave that seemed to break the very fabric of the chamber's communication systems. "We killed ourselves." The human delegation remained absolutely still. This wasn't their moment to comfort. This was their moment to present truth. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez leaned slightly towards Sarah, his neural interface transmitting a private message. Psychological impact at 97.3% effectiveness. Civilizational narrative collapse imminent. The Galactic Council Chamber, a marvel of interspecies diplomatic engineering, began to react. Atmospheric regulators fluctuated. Communication interfaces started to produce unexpected feedback loops. The very infrastructure of galactic diplomacy was struggling to process what was happening. Two civilizations were watching their entire understanding of themselves collapse in real time. The luminary arch-mediator's energy patterns began to produce something unprecedented. What could only be described as computational tears. Pure information expressing a grief so profound it transcended linguistic communication. How? It transmitted. How could we not see? Sarah Chen stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not with any theatrical gesture. Just a simple, precise movement that drew every computational matrix in the chamber towards her. "Perspective," she said quietly. "Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is simply the ability to step back and see the entire picture." The genetic analysis continued to flow, showing not just the shared history, but the potential future. Dormant genetic sequences that could potentially bridge the evolutionary divide between the Krellings and Luminary. Computational pathways that suggested not just reconciliation, but potential reunification. This wasn't just a diplomatic presentation. This was a civilizational autopsy. And humanity was holding the scalpel. The chamber went silent. Not the silence of respect. Not the silence of diplomatic protocol. The silence of absolute, devastating understanding. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of profound understanding. Sarah Chen understood this better than anyone in the Galactic Council chamber. As the alien civilizations absorbed the devastating truth, she began the most critical part of their mission: reconstruction. Conflict. She began, her voice cutting through the computational shock like a quantum laser, is not a destination. It's a failure of communication. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez activated the secondary data projection. What appeared was not just a resolution proposal, but a complete blueprint for civilizational reconciliation. It was more than a diplomatic document. It was a computational roadmap for survival. The proposal began with something unprecedented: a full computational and cultural exchange program. Not a treaty. Not a diplomatic agreement. A complete systemic reset. The holographic displays began to show potential collaborative projects that could bridge the evolutionary divide between the Krullinks and Luminary. Technological exchanges that could leverage their unique evolutionary paths. Scientific collaborations that could unlock potential far beyond their current capabilities. Your separation, Sarah explained, was not a natural evolution. It was a computational accident that became a cultural prison. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing modules had done something extraordinary. They had identified not just the source of the conflict, but potential pathways for reunification. Genetic markers that could potentially create a hybrid communication matrix. Technological interfaces that could bridge the silicon-based and energy-based evolutionary paths. The Krullinks representative, Captain Lorax, struggled to maintain computational composure. His crystalline structure flickered between absolute shock and something resembling hope. We propose, Sarah continued, a 5-phase reunification protocol. The first phase was radical in its simplicity: complete, transparent, communication. Every communication record would be made available. Not just current records, but historical archives. Every message, every trade agreement, every scientific exchange that had been deliberately erased would be reconstructed and shared. Dr. Aisha Okoro had spent years developing linguistic algorithms that could do more than translate. They could contextualize. Her system would help both species understand not just the words, but the entire communicative context of their shared history. The second phase targeted technological integration. The Krullinks' silicon-based computational matrices would be paired with the Luminaries' energy-based information systems, not as separate entities, but as complementary technologies. Your evolutionary paths, Sarah explained, are not a division. They're a potential symbiosis. The chamber's atmospheric regulators began to respond to the computational complexity of the proposal. Diplomatic interfaces that had remained static for millennia started to recalibrate. The very infrastructure of galactic communication was being forced to evolve. Marcus Rodriguez's neural interface was capturing every microscopic change. This wasn't just a diplomatic resolution. This was a systemic reboot of 2 entire civilizations. The third phase was perhaps the most radical: a joint genetic research initiative. The dormant genetic sequences that connected the Krullinks and Luminary would be studied, potentially creating hybrid communication matrices that could bridge their evolutionary divide. We're not suggesting reconciliation, Sarah said quietly. We're suggesting evolution. The Luminary arch-mediator, still recovering from the emotional shock of their discovered history, began to stabilize. Its energy patterns started to form something resembling a computational question mark. Why? It transmitted. Why would humanity propose this? Sarah's response was simple: because conflict is a luxury no advanced civilization can afford. The proposal continued. Economic integration, cultural exchange programs, collaborative scientific research that would leverage the unique evolutionary paths of both species. But underlying it all was something more profound: a fundamental reimagining of what conflict resolution could mean. This wasn't diplomacy as the Galactic Council understood it. This was systemic problem-solving. This was treating two entire civilizations, not as opposing forces, but as a single complex system waiting to be understood. The human delegation watched with calculated composure. They had come with more than evidence. They had come with a solution. And they were just getting started. The aftermath was not what anyone expected. As news of the human intervention spread across the galactic communication networks, something unprecedented began to happen. Other species, those who had watched the Krellink's luminary conflict for generations, started to look inward. The quantum archives of the Galactic Council began to experience what could only be described as a systemic breakdown. Not a technical failure, but a computational awakening. Dr. Elena Gonzalez, the human delegation's security chief, watched the cascading effects with a mixture of clinical precision and barely contained excitement. Her neural interfaces were tracking communication patterns that suggested something far more profound than a simple diplomatic resolution was taking place. They're re-examining everything, she transmitted privately to Sarah Chen. Every single conflict. The Zartak Confederacy was the first to break. A collective of silicon-based hive mind civilizations that had maintained 3 separate internal conflicts for over 2,000 years, they suddenly initiated a comprehensive communication audit. Their central computational matrix began requesting historical records with a ferocity that crashed multiple communication satellites. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez's predictive algorithms had suggested this might happen. But the scale was beyond even their most optimistic projections. Conflict, he had theorized during their initial research, is often just a failure of comprehensive understanding. Now, they were watching that theory become galactic reality. The human approach, treating civilizational conflicts as complex computational problems rather than territorial disputes, was spreading like a computational virus. Each species began to look at their historical conflicts through a lens they had never considered before. The luminary arch-mediator, still recovering from its previous emotional breakdown, began to transmit something unprecedented. Not just data, not just analysis, but a form of computational apology that transcended traditional communication protocols. We did not see, it transmitted to the Krellink's representatives. The message contained layers of information, genetic markers, historical records, emotional context, that would have been impossible to comprehend just hours earlier. Captain Lorax's response was equally complex. His crystalline structure began to resonate with frequencies that suggested not just understanding, but a form of civilizational grief and hope simultaneously. Sarah Chen understood something profound about intelligence. True intelligence isn't about having the right answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions. The Galactic Council chamber, once a place of rigid diplomatic protocols, had transformed. Communication interfaces that had remained static for millennia were now dynamic, adaptive systems. The very infrastructure of galactic diplomacy was being rewritten in real time. Dr. Aisha Okoro's linguistic algorithms were capturing something extraordinary. The communication patterns between species were changing, not just in content, but in fundamental structure. Languages that had been isolated for millennia were finding common ground. We're witnessing the birth of a new type of galactic communication, she transmitted to the team. Her neural interfaces were capturing linguistic correlations that suggested something far more profound than simple translation. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing modules were working overtime. He was tracking the computational ripple effects of their intervention. Each communication audit, each historical review, was creating new pathways of understanding. The human delegation had come with a simple mission: resolve a conflict. They were rewriting the fundamental understanding of civilizational interaction. Other species began to approach the human team, not with the previous condescension, but with a newfound respect. The Arnax Collective, a species of energy-based computational entities, requested a full briefing on the human analytical methodologies. How? Their chief diplomat transmitted. Did you see what we could not? Sarah Chen's response was elegant in its simplicity. We asked different questions. The Galactic Council was no longer just a diplomatic body. It was becoming a living, adaptive system of mutual understanding. The rigid hierarchies, the calcified conflicts, the generations of misunderstandings were being systematically dismantled. Humanity had not just resolved a conflict. They had introduced a new paradigm of civilizational interaction. And they were just getting started. The final resolution wasn't signed, it was computed. 43 hours after Sarah Chen's initial presentation, the Galactic Council had transformed from a rigid diplomatic body to a living, adaptive system of mutual understanding. What had begun as a resolution to a single conflict had become a fundamental reimagining of civilizational interaction. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez's predictive algorithms were working overtime, tracking the cascade of changes rippling across galactic communication networks. This was more than diplomacy. This was evolutionary acceleration. The Krellinks and Luminary stood together, not as former enemies, but as the first test case of a new approach to civilizational development. Their joint research team was already developing hybrid communication matrices that would have been considered impossible just days earlier. We were never truly separate. Captain Lorax transmitted, his crystalline structure now resonating with frequencies that suggested something between scientific excitement and profound philosophical understanding. We were just waiting to be reconnected. The Luminary Archmediator's response was equally profound. Its energy patterns now contained layers of information that suggested not just reconciliation, but a complete reimagining of their shared evolutionary path. Sarah Chen understood that this was about more than resolving a conflict. This was about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to complex systemic challenges. The human delegation had arrived with a simple toolkit: comprehensive data analysis, contextual understanding, a willingness to challenge established narratives, the ability to see connections others missed. What they had done was nothing short of revolutionary. Dr. Aisha Okoro's linguistic algorithms were capturing something extraordinary. The communication patterns between species were evolving in real time. Languages that had been isolated for millennia were finding common ground. Translation was no longer about converting words, but about understanding context, motivation, potential. Jonathan Kim's quantum processing modules revealed the true depth of their intervention. Each communication audit, each historical review, was creating new pathways of understanding that transcended traditional diplomatic approaches. The Galactic Council Chamber, once a place of rigid protocols and calcified conflicts, had become a living laboratory of potential. Other species were beginning to approach the human team, not with the previous condescension, but with a profound respect that bordered on reverence. The Arnax Collective requested full access to human analytical methodologies. The Zittel Confederacy was completely restructuring their own internal communication systems. "How," asked the chief diplomat of the Quantum Concordance, "did you see what we could not?" Sarah Chen's response remained consistent, simple, powerful. We asked different questions. The resolution that emerged was not a traditional treaty. It was a comprehensive framework for civilizational development that emphasized total communicative transparency, contextual understanding over literal interpretation, collaborative problem-solving, adaptive learning systems, recognition of evolutionary potential over historical conflict. Dr. Elena Gonzalez's security analyses suggested something even more profound. This wasn't just a diplomatic breakthrough. This was the beginning of a new stage of galactic evolution. The human team had done something unprecedented. They had transformed conflict resolution from a reactive process to a proactive, adaptive system of mutual understanding. As the final computational signatures were registered, Sarah Chen allowed herself the smallest moment of reflection. Their research had begun in a small, underfunded facility. A team of academic outcasts who believed that most conflicts were fundamentally misunderstandings. Now they were rewriting the fundamental understanding of civilizational interaction. The Galactic Council was no longer just a diplomatic body. It was becoming a living, adaptive system of mutual understanding. The rigid hierarchies, the calcified conflicts, the generations of misunderstandings were being systematically dismantled. Captain Lorax approached Sarah, his crystalline structure reflecting light in ways that suggested something between gratitude and profound wonder. "We were blind," he transmitted, "and you helped us see." Humanity had not just resolved a conflict. They had introduced a new paradigm of existence. And they were just getting started.